All right, whenever you're ready.
All right. Now this is an introduction to an account of my personal life and as an affectionate contribution to our family history. My oral history done by the Naval Institute has my official record of Navy service, which does not include very much of the family history. And so the intent here is to piece out more of the things that are personal, things that happened to the family, along with where we were at the time and what I was doing in the Navy. So I'll talk about a number of things here. One is a little about the sturdy ancestors that brought us to where we are today, my three brothers and myself. A recollection of our boyhood in Perth Amboy, as best as I can remember. Some stories about my naval service, 38 years of active service in the Navy, 4 as midshipman and 34 as a commissioned officer. And then active service as a retired person in Annapolis for 34 years. It's obvious now that you are just as busy and maybe as productive in your retired life as you are in active service, or can be. I was Dean of Admissions for 13 years at the Naval Academy as a civilian member of the faculty. I was president of our Alumni Association for 3 years, elected to help run a capital campaign, the first one we ever had, and built Alumni Hall. A director of the Annapolis Bank and Trust Company for about 13 years, until retired by age, and then director and trustee of a number of foundations and other boards. So there's been a lot going on. You will see an intense pride in my family, my own family, and the family that preceded us, our families past and present. And there's an immense pleasure you will sense and gratitude for 2 wonderful marriages. And that is so important to success in life. 2 wonderful wives, beautiful, spirited women, loving, competent, who brought values, wisdom, and strength to me and our family. Barbara, the mother of 4 of our children, and Patricia, who having raised her 4 and then taken on 4 more who were much younger, has been a wonderful help and a wonderful partner when we married in 1973, 2 years after Barbara's death. Both became full partners in a full life and have been a constant source of inspiration and love for me. Then you'll notice a constant theme of interest in and even deep affection for every aspect of going to sea. This started when I was a boy, and service in the Navy, of course, cruising and ocean racing, wherever we've been, owning boats, helping young people to go to sea. Been involved in sea exploring for the Boy Scouts for many years, and for about 12 or 13 years was chairman of the Sea Exploring Committee, the National Sea Exploring Committee. Been racing and cruising with midshipmen, working with the American Sail Training Association as the Vice Commodore, and then with Bob McWethy in the Naval Sailing Association, which is a worldwide group of sailing clubs wherever the Navy gathers, and the Fails Committee, who advises the superintendent in sailing at the Naval Academy. And then as part of this, of course, members of various clubs, New York Yacht Club for many years, Cruising Club of America, Storm Trysail Club, Naval Academy Sailing Squadron, and been involved in active participation in all those, and sometimes as an officer. Even got around to writing a book one time, sailing at the U.S. Naval Academy. When we had our 150th anniversary of the Academy, it was obvious we didn't have a history of sailing, which is the common thread throughout the history of the Academy. Started when sailing ships were, the days of fighting sail, were the main part of the curriculum at the Naval Academy. We're heading down for a sail, Ginger Cove, 18 August 2004. And we're heading down through the trail in the woods
until we get down to the boat. First thing we do is put on boots so we can launch the dinghy. And every time I do this, I think of my grandfather's warning when I used to work with him in his barn on a farm in Indiana. He'd always say, turn your boots upside down and shake the mice out before you put your feet in.
I think of my father's endorsement. Dad grew up on a farm. Grandfather was a rancher and a sheep farmer. And Dad's comment always when he was speaking well of somebody that he had met, that he or she came of good stock. And that's a breeder's recollection of how you tell whether somebody has some chance of surviving. Well, here were the early settlers, and they were all of good stock. Alexander and Jean McNitt arrived in 1722 from Ulster Province in Ireland. And Michael and Catherine Oule, their descendant, Mary Ellen, married my grandfather, came from Germany in 1753. And Charles and Jane Naganay came from Ulster Province, Ireland in 1795. And then on mother's side, Johannes and Anne-Marie Heilemann from Germany, 1732, and Edward and Catherine Taylor from England in 1672. And Barbara's ancestor, on her mother's side, Isaac Allerton, arrived as a member of the original Pilgrim Company on the Mayflower and was a governor of Plymouth from 1621 to 1631.
Okay, we've launched the dinghy. Now row out to the boat at the mooring.
Well, my grandfather, James David McNitt, was orphaned when he was 11 and had a tough life. His father and mother had come from Pennsylvania in wagons, with his mother driving one wagon, and he was 2 years old in that wagon, and 5 brothers and sisters, one of whom was an infant, and father driving the other wagon. They settled in Indiana, not far from Logansport, built a cabin. Next year, she found a better piece of land, built another cabin, and a year later, father died. That's my grandfather's father. And his mother died 9 years later fighting a forest fire. In the meantime, she'd fought off Indians, fought off fires, and welcomed travelers who would stop overnight, sharing whatever she had with them. A wonderful, sturdy family, and James David, at the age of 11, minimum schooling, apprenticed in town in Logansport, learned the trade of merchandising, grocery store, learned how to judge feed, judge stock, and most of all, how to judge men. Eventually ran his own business, became the founder and president of the Logansport Bank and Trust Company, of the Logansport Bank and Trust Company. And when he died, people came from all over the county because of their great affection for James McNitt, who had saved their farms during the Depression, finding some way to not call their loans.
got a sailboat.
Very nice.
Yeah, this boat is called an Alerion, A-L-E-R-I-O-N, Alerion Express 20. It's 20 feet long. The lines are taken directly from Nathaniel Harrisoff's Alerion, which he drew in about 1912. It was his favorite boat of all the boats he designed, including the America's Cup yachts. Because he liked it so much, he took it to France with him and had it over there for several years. But This is a modern design by Carl Schumacher, taking the lines of the Herreshoff Alarian and keeping the above water lines the same, but adding a 5.5-foot bulb keel and a tall rig, and then designing it so one person can sail it. All the lines lead into the cockpit. We can sit where you're sitting and put a reef in the boat and the mainsail in about 30 seconds if you're in a hurry. The jib tends itself on a Gary Hoyt boom that swings back and forth on a pivot. And the mainsail has what are called full batten main. The battens run the full length of the mainsail, which keeps it from flailing around if you have to drop it suddenly. Contained in lazy jacks, the ropes that go up on either side of the boom. When it was delivered on the dock, of course, it was unrigged. It came in a trailer from TPI in Bristol, Rhode Island. And I had a rigger come over and help me put the mast up and rig it. An old-time rigger, and he just stood there and looked at the boat for a couple of minutes and walked around it and said, "Sweet boat." Then he walked around it a second time. "Sweet boat." And then we began to work on putting it together. I think they're clever in the way they advertise it. They say it's always fun to have the prettiest girl at the dance. And that's what this boat is. Well, I think we'll tack and get out with the windows again. Ready about. This is our 6th season with this boat. First thing you have to do, of course, is to think of a name. Our dinghy is named Silver Babe. It was a gift from our friend Bill Mack. And the first suggestion by one of our grandchildren was call it Silver Dude. But we didn't think that would work too well because it should be a feminine name. Then a friend of ours at Ginger Cove gave us a copy of his Mrs. Burns' Dictionary of Ancient and Preposterous Words. And in there we found a word, phonixity. Phonixity, although not commonly known, is an unusual word that means a model of excellence and a paragon of beauty. We thought that suited very well, so we named the boat Phonixity. Sometime we'll take friends and sail over to London Town Public House, which is right across from where we are headed now. We'll tie up to the dock, and Pat, who used to be a docent, knows the history of London Town and knows the gardens very well. And we'll take our friends up on a tour of London Town Public House and the gardens, which are beautiful. And sometimes on a nice evening we'll sail in the other direction up the South River to Mike's, tie the boat up the dock and order a crab feast, and then sail back to the mooring. Just ahead of the dock there is the Brown House. It used to be a tavern because a ferry ran from this dock over on the other side of South River. And when bridges were built and they no longer needed a ferry, this finally became an almshouse where the poor folks were taken care of. Coming in close to that dock makes me think of the game that Brother Jim and I used to play with a sailboat at Perth Amboy. Jim usually would be the instigator of this stunt. And he'd be sailing and I'd be up on the deck and I'd be chatting with him and he'd be looking at me and paying no attention to a big power boat that would be anchored there with in what we called the little bay just across from Perth Amboy, where power boats like to go for tanker, have lunch, because there's kind of a lee there and not much in the way of waves. Kind of a lee there and not much in the way of waves. So we'd sail right up, aimed right for the after deck where the owner would be with his guests sitting at tables on the after deck having drinks or perhaps lunch. And headed right at him at right angles. And Jim pretending he couldn't see him, and I'd be chatting with him. Of course, my back's to the boat. And when we got about 100 feet away, of course, the owner would begin to watch us pretty carefully. When we got about 50 feet away, the owner would put down his glass and ease his chair out a little bit from the table. And then Jim would hold on until we were probably about 2 feet away. He knew exactly how close we could come without hitting it by tacking. And then he'd look up, and that look on his face and say, "Oh," you know, and then he'd spin the rudder over, and he'd throw the rudder over, and we'd spin right around and miss it by about 6 inches. By that time, the owners jumped up, knocked over the card table, and everybody's pointing and fussing at us, and we'd sail off laughing. Terrible thing to do. We is the boat that we built under the porch, a 15-foot open boat that had what was called a washboard, just a deck that's about perhaps a foot wide that ran all the way around it. It had a centerboard, no keel, sloop rig, and you could capsize it quite easily. You could turn it over and fill it up with water. Well, I don't think we ever did. We would moor it at a buoy off of Fox Booze's dock on Perth Amboy, out in front of where our house was. And the next year, in order to keep the boat at a mooring out in the bay, we built a second boat, which we call Wee, W-E-E. And that was a Billy Atkins design, a 10-foot cedar plank dinghy, and a beautiful little boat, which we could pull up on the beach at night. And what we would do is go down in the morning, unlock the Wee from its skids, push it into the water, and row out to Wee, W-E. That was named for Lindbergh's book the year before we built the boat. Lindbergh had flown across the Atlantic Ocean. Of course, he was a great hero for all of us. And we'd, just as we did today, tie up the dinghy to the buoy, cast off our 15-foot sailboat Wee, and then take off for the day. And as we got a little more experienced and gained the trust of our parents, why, we would sometimes go off and go camping. We'd leave early in the day and be gone for 3 or 4 days down the bay. But I think one of our favorite trips is just to sail out in the bay on a Sunday, go across to the other side of the bay at Keyport, go ashore, pull a boat up on the beach or anchor just off, swim in, buy ice cream cones, swim back and jump on a boat and sail home. It's a wonderful life for boys. Enjoyed every minute of it. Once in a while there'd be a race, say on 4th of July, for all the different boats, all different sizes. And the rule was that the boat that came in last would bring in the windward mark, the buoy that the boats would turn on the first leg. And usually we'd be the ones that would bring the windward mark home.
Every Sunday we would take a walk with Father, and he would take us down along the waterfront, down to the dry dock, always explaining the interesting things we'd see. Wintertime when there's snow, we'd slide down the hill on Lewis Street, and Mother'd be right there with us. We'd have circuses in the backyard, for which we would charge admission and sell tickets. If the kids were sick, we would since we all lived in 4 beds in a row in one room, there's a dormitory room on the 2nd floor of 1 Lewis Street, they'd wrap a sheet around that bed, and this kid then was in quarantine until he got well. And sometimes it took a week or 2 in those days to get well. We loved to swim. we're only a block from the beach. And the docks are right across the street from us. So when we learned how to swim, we'd swim off the docks. Dad built a boat in the backyard for us, which was maybe 15 feet long, just a deck and a cabin forward and a top. And we could pretend that was any kind of a ship, any kind of a boat. We played on it year after year. Mother gave up on trying to keep gardens in that yard. She'd have a little garden way over in the corner, but baseball, basketball, boats, and the normal horseplay made it impossible. It was beaten into a solid clay surface. Coal deliveries, coal furnace. Coal was delivered by a horse and wagon or a truck, and a coal heaver would carry it on by bag out of the truck, dump the bag down a chute into a coal bin in the cellar. And Dad would put the coal in the furnace, and every morning the first thing we'd hear on a winter morning would be Dad getting up early, going down below, cranking the grate to drop the ashes, and turn up the draft and get the fire going so the boiler would heat up, steam would come up, and the house would get warm. We did a lot of camping, cruised all the way down to Sandy Hook, stayed down there for a week camping on the beach, raced on weekends occasionally. Then we got caught up in motorboats. And there were no water skis in those days, but we would ride an aquaplane, which is a plank with a bridle that should hold from the front end and tow behind a powerboat. And again, I got caught. I had a boy on my shoulders, the bridle around my back and under my arms, and happily going along till we hit a wake or something and fell off. Fat Ramsey fell off, and the aquaplane pearl dived, took me down to the bottom of the bay. And this dumb kid driving the powerboat wasn't watching. So here I am with the bridle with a half turn around both ankles, and the wake from being pulled through the water. I couldn't even reach up to where my feet were, and being dragged feet first, probably 10 or 15 feet under the surface. I thought it would never end. Finally, this dumb kid woke up, pulled the motor, stopped the motor, and we floated up. And I got a good deep breath, but I thought that was the end of me right there. Then we'd take this aquaplane, we'd go up to New Brunswick and water ski aquaplane around between the concrete piers of the bridge, sort of slalom between the piers. And then the dumbest thing we would do would be to go out in the channel where a cargo freighter was going through in ballast, which meant that half the propeller is above water and half below, and the propeller flumping around like this. And we'd dare each other to get as close as we could to the propeller and sheer out again. And again, survived that. Mother asked my father one time, aren't you worried about these kids doing these things? He says, oh, we got 4 of them. Just teasing her. Depression years, 1930s, were hard. We had very little money, and we made our own ice for an ice box. We had a window box, which in the wintertime we used as a cool box for the food. We, in the kitchen, Dad made a fireless cooker, which is an insulated cylinder about this big, counterweighted through pulleys on the ceiling with a lead weight over here, and would move it up and down. Inside that would be 2 or 3 stones about this big around that would be heated in the oven while dinner was being cooked, and then put in the fireless cooker. And on top of that would be aluminum pans or pots with lids with cereal for breakfast, prunes for breakfast, and the vegetables for the next day's dinner. Pull down the fireless cooker and it would cook at slow speed all night. Blueberries were sold door to door by people that didn't have any money, and Mother was wonderful. Even though we had none, we would buy them. She would buy furniture from the Appalachian folks that made them because they were in desperate straits. Boy Scouts are part of our life. It's the only game in town. And we were all members of Fritz Abeg's Troop 6. One after another, we all became Eagle Scouts. Sometimes I tell the local scouts it's because my father was the chairman of the troop committee. That probably had something to do with it. He certainly encouraged the troop committee. That probably had something to do with it. He certainly encouraged us. And the chairman of the troop committee's job was to go up there on winter mornings and start the furnace so that by nighttime you'd have a warm parish house. Fritz Albag, our scoutmaster, a tough Swiss mountain trooper, ran a firm troop. And it's pretty amazing that we ended up there with probably 4 members of the troop became Naval Academy graduates, 3 of whom became admirals. Boats were a big part of our lives. We found a derelict rowboat on the beach, had a hole in it, we patched the hole, and for the first summer paddled it around until Dad got worried that we might get swept out on the tide and bought us a couple of oars. Then we discovered sailing. A neighbor who lived next door had a small catboat, and once we sailed with him, that was the end of it. We had to have a sailboat. Realizing that, Dad built one with us underneath the front porch of the house. Took a year. He bought a kit of a boat designed by John Alden called a Buccaneer, perfect for boys. And we assembled the kit, put the planks on, put the deck on, made a mast out of a 4x4, cut it down until it was round, put a block in at the top for the halyard, painted the boat and launched it, and for, I guess, 15 years or so, that was our home at summer. Wonderful, wonderful boat. Then next year we built a 10-foot dinghy designed by Atkins. Built this one from the drawings itself, not a kit. Planked it with cedar, oak ribs, and a beautiful little dinghy.
Well, what we're doing here is sailing out the South River. South River empties into the Chesapeake Bay. Chesapeake Bay into the Atlantic Ocean. If we went straight ahead here and around the point that's ahead on the left side, it would take us to Annapolis.
You know, we're talking about my naval service from a family, personal point of view, not the actual things I did in any great detail on these jobs. But my naval service began when I became a midshipman at the Naval Academy. So the first question is, how did I end up at the Naval Academy? I didn't know anything about it. It was almost a surprise to me that this would be an option that we ought to consider. But it turns out later, I didn't know this at the time, that my mother's first cousin, Joe Heileman, who was a Naval Academy graduate in the class of 1901, served through the rank of captain, had died in 1933, which was when I was finishing high school. And Joe Heileman and my mother were very close, almost like brother and sister. And so a combination of grandmother Waring and her brother and memory of Joe Heileman, they concluded they should have somebody in the family continue the naval tradition. And it just happened that I was the oldest kid and about ready to go someplace. And so Father suggested to me, why don't you take the congressman's examination for a nomination for experience and see whether you can pass it or not. Well, I did. I went up to New Brunswick, signed up and took the civil service exam that Congressman Eaton of Plainfield offered for a nomination to the Naval Academy beginning in June 1934. And certainly to my surprise, and probably greatly to my father's surprise, I had the highest grade in the exam and was offered the principal appointment of Congressman Eaton. Now what do I do?
Well, the story is that I wasn't sure I was going to be admitted to the Naval Academy because I'd been told by my congressman that I'd won his nomination by taking the exam. And then they asked me to go up to the Brooklyn Navy Yard and take a medical exam, which I did. And they said, you've got a crooked back, scoliosis, and they're not going to admit you. So I wrote Congressman Eaton and said, you better give this to somebody else because I'm not going to be passing physically. And he said, well, he sent me a nice letter and said, thanks for telling me, but why don't you try it anyway? Maybe they won't notice it. So now I'm down here trying to decide whether to take a chance on it and get my medical overlooked or go up to Dartmouth and work my way through college. So what I did was come over here and sit on a wooden bulkhead right here and look at the Naval Academy and said, what am I going to do? So I sort of symbolically flipped a coin, heads both ways. I said, well, what I'll do is go over there in the morning and take the physical, and if they pass me, I'm in. I'll be a midshipman. If they don't, I'll go up and ski at Dartmouth, which I'd just soon do anyway. So I didn't care either way. Because I didn't know anything about the Naval Academy. Didn't know anything about the Navy. And having made that decision, went home, got a good night's sleep, came over the next morning and stood with my back against the wall, and nobody noticed that I had a crooked back, and I'm a midshipman. That's how I got started.
Title, John Bliss.
Pull it with it. And go.
Title of this picture, John Bliss, roommate, 1934 to 1936. We decided we would room together at the end of our first summer and became fast friends, probably my best friend for the rest of my life. John decided after 2 years that he was too regimented, resigned from the Naval Academy, went to work for the Salcon steel plant in Bethlehem, and later he told me he was more regimented there than he ever was at home. Title of this picture, 1935, After Sunday Dinner, Such Hard Work. Picture of Midshipman McNitt, flaked down on his bunk, happily content with nothing to do. I remember one time having a wrestling match with John Bliss, my roommate, and he had managed to get me flat on my back on my bunk, and he was holding on to the bed rails and holding me flat, and didn't notice that the officer of the deck had come in. And I'm seeing this, he is not, and we should not have been doing this during study hour. And I said to John in a conversational voice, what would you do if the officer of the deck was in here watching you? And he made some rude comment, at which point the officer of the deck put us both on report. Title, 1935, View of Noon Formation from Bancroft Hall. It's a picture of midshipmen lined up on the terrace outside of the dormitory in Bancroft Hall. Every day at noon, when the weather was suitable, we'd be out there lined up like this and then march into dinner or to breakfast. 1936 half-raters and knockabouts and starboats, USNA. This is a line of the sailing boats used that we trained in, the gaff-rigged half-raters, the Marconi-rigged knockabouts, moored to the seawall. Of course, in the days of square-rigged sailing ships, seamanship and the ability to handle a ship under sail was absolutely fundamental to a naval officer's career. If he couldn't do that, he couldn't do anything, because if he couldn't bring your ship within range of the guns of another sailing ship, there's no way you could successfully handle a fighting engagement at sea. So seamanship being on the weather gauge, as they called it, the right side, and then closing within gun range was terribly important. And so much of the time of midshipmen's stay at the Naval Academy was devoted to either seamanship or to gunnery or navigation. As soon as we had steamships, that was forgotten. And it wasn't until, let's see, it was 1909 was the last summer cruise under sail. And then about 1936, the midshipmen themselves realized that sailing was a sport, and there was intercollegiate competition, and very much wanted to get back into it. But behind this also was an appreciation that being able to handle small boats under sail and then bigger ones was fundamental to developing skills at sea. Seamanship, small unit leadership, navigation, handling situations that came up with bad weather, and the matter of rigging, handling heavy rigging, all were things that naval officers ought to master. And this is the way you bring young midshipmen along, to enjoy going to sea and to be comfortable in that environment. And he had managed to get me flat on my back on my bunk, and he was holding on to the bed rails and holding me flat, and didn't notice that the officer of the deck had come in. And I'm seeing this, he is not, and we should not have been doing this during study hour. And I said to John in a conversational voice, "What would you do if the officer's deck was in here watching you?" And he made some rude comment, at which point the officer's deck put us both on report. Title, 1935, View of Noon Formation from Bancroft Hall. It's a picture of midshipmen lined up on the terrace outside of the dormitory at Bancroft Hall. Every day at noon, when the weather was suitable, we'd be out there lined up like this and then march into dinner or to breakfast. 1936 half-raters and knockabouts and starboats, USNA. This is a line of the sailing boats used that we trained in, the gaff-rigged half-raters, the Marconi-rigged knockabouts, moored to the seawall. Of course, in the days of square-rigged sailing ships, seamanship and the ability to handle a ship under sail was absolutely fundamental to a naval officer's career. If he couldn't do that, he couldn't do anything, because if he couldn't bring your ship within range of the guns of another sailing ship, there's no way you could successfully handle a fighting engagement at sea. So seamanship, being on the weather gauge, as they called it, the right side, and then closing within gun range, was terribly important. And so much of the time of midshipmen's stay at the Naval Academy was devoted to either seamanship or to gunnery or navigation. As soon as we had steamships, that was forgotten. And it wasn't until, let's see, it was 1909 was the last summer cruise under sail. And then about 1936, the midshipmen themselves realized that sailing was a sport, and there was intercollegiate competition, and very much wanted to get back into it. But behind this also was an appreciation that being able to handle small boats under sail and then bigger ones was fundamental to developing skills at sea. Seamanship, small unit leadership, navigation, handling situations that came up with bad weather, and the matter of rigging, handling heavy rigging, all were things that naval officers ought to master. And this is the way you bring young midshipmen along, to enjoy going to sea and to be comfortable in that environment. That had been forgotten. And the midshipmen themselves, by setting up a boat club and beginning to get boats and beginning to compete, reminded the naval officers at the Naval Academy that this was part of their curriculum. Not consciously, they just wanted to have some fun. They just wanted to compete. But they began to realize this is important. And it's come full swing now. We have a superintendent here who emphasizes this every day. I almost resigned from the Naval Academy. My roommate John Bliss resigned after 2 years, thought he was being regimented too much. My reason was not that I was being regimented, but I didn't think it was much of an education. I'd had the experience of being taught by a Columbia professor who was out of work in a junior college in Perth Amboy for 1 semester of a course called Contemporary Civilization. And this was so mind-opening for me, so exciting to talk about everything about the big sweep of history in the world, from James's Big Bang Theory all the way to the most recent problems of World War II on the way. And that I thought that's what a university ought to be, and I didn't find that at the Naval Academy. We did a lot of sketching boilers and memorizing the steps in making smokeless powder. We knew all about how guns are made and how to shoot them. And we had a reasonable course in math, a reasonable course in thermodynamics, a little bit of physics, a little chemistry. But we never got into these big issues that I thought were so exciting. So I sent for my father and I said, "Dad, come on down, talk to me." and we spent all of a Sunday afternoon. His advice was, this is really not a university. It's a professional school to get you ready for the Navy. And you don't know what the Navy's like yet. Perhaps you ought to think about finishing, and then if you don't like the Navy, bail out as soon as they let you. But until then, try finishing it, because you may find this very worthwhile. That was good advice. That's what I did. And I finished up probably in the upper 10% of the class academically, and happily accepted my commission from Franklin D. Roosevelt, who came down, President of the United States, to congratulate us. She said, "You graduate with a certification by the government of the United States that you're a gentleman. And the fact you've been able to graduate from the Naval Academy at all provides that you're scholars. I want you to prove that you have another qualification, that you're also thoroughgoing, up-to-date, intelligent American citizens. I congratulate you on your graduation. Your Commander-in-Chief is proud of you. Good luck." I like that. Short, to the point. Of course, he knew the war was coming. He knew we had a job. 607 of us entered as midshipmen in 1934. 438 graduated and were commissioned, Navy and Marine Corps, a couple of them in the Philippine Constabulary. There are now about 65 to 70 still living. When the last member of our class retired, 5 had become vice admirals or lieutenant generals, 34 rear admirals. 9 ships were named for our classmates who died during World War II. And the names of 51 of our classmates are on a monument over at the cemetery for people who died in combat but whose bodies were not recovered. We don't know where they are. Some crashed with airplanes, some are on submarines on the bottom. And this is a way of remembering them. What a ship does when she's newly commissioned is take a shakedown cruise to see whether she's really put together pretty well. Our shakedown cruise was to the Caribbean. We went to Curacao and then went on to Brazil. And as we crossed the equator, we had a celebration. So the next picture is crossing the line, 1939. And here are 2 of the crew dressed for the ceremony. I was not a shellback, and so I went through that ceremony. My first assignment, well, as a matter of fact, the night before, the shellbacks are small in number. Those are people who have crossed the line before. The polywogs are the ones who are yet to be initiated. And they got their licks in the night before by chasing down the shellbacks and locking them up here and there, until it got so raucous the executive officer decided that things were getting out of hand, and he stopped everything cold until the next morning. Next morning I was awakened at before dawn and accused of, as a commissary officer, of not providing yeast for the chief commissary steward. As a result, the crew had been eating hardtack instead of bread since we left. I was ordered to go up to the forecastle with a telescope in my full dress uniform with no pants on and search for the line, and that's where I stood until breakfast time. The ceremony consisted of appearing before the royal dentist in a chair, who pretended to pull out your teeth with a fuse puller. Then you had to go to the royal baby and kiss the royal baby's stomach of the fattest sailor they had with a big bullseye painted around his belly button. And then you're tipped over backwards into a tank and a couple of shellbacks in there, and they'd hold you underwater until you could shout, "Shellback!" And of course, as soon as you started to say shellback, you're back under the water. And after a few sputtering attempts, you were released out of the tank and had to crawl through a windsail, which is a canvas pipe about 20 inches in diameter, which had been filled with garbage. And as you crawl through the tank, through the windpipe, the windsail, the crew are lined up alongside it with rope's ends, and they're hammering on the top of it as you walk your way through it. So by the time you get through with that, well, you realize you've been properly initiated and you're not anxious to do it again. I have a big certificate someplace that shows that I've done this. We had another incident that could have ended my time in the Navy right there. We had the ship up in Philadelphia doing a post-shakedown availability, as they call it, and we took her out to sea for another trial. Went down the Delaware River, went out, spent a day or two, and then came back at night, heading up the Delaware River with landfall, supposed to be the entrance buoys for the Delaware River at probably about 4 in the morning. I took the watch over at 4, told I would see a white light, did not see it. At 4:20, I still hadn't seen it. I called the navigator and the captain, told him again I hadn't seen a light, I didn't know where we were. At probably about another 10 minutes, I saw a flashing white light and physically went in and got the captain out of the sea cabin and told him to come on the bridge because we were I thought we were headed for trouble. We sure were. He came out on the bridge, did what I should have done, said, "All engines stop." And then we got to looking around, and as the haze lifted up ahead, we could see a string of lights, and we're headed directly into the boardwalk of Rehoboth Beach, 20 miles south of the entrance. And if we had not stopped the ship then, within another 5 or 10 minutes, we'd have been up in the sand and maybe still there. What did we learn? In those days, junior officers never changed course or speed without consulting the captain. You must let the junior officers learn how to do these things themselves so they use their own judgment when it's time to do so. We were not really ready for war, we discovered. Even though this was a new submarine, only about a year and a half old at this point. We took her up in one of the locks, as they call it in Scotland, and I dove it, put it on the bottom, and the British sound measurement team checked our noises, and they told us, "You're so noisy, you're off the scale, we can't possibly give you a reading as to how good you are. We can hear your trim pump forward has a bad bearing. We can hear your crew walking in the floor plates back aft. You haven't got them screwed down tight. We can hear your cook washing silverware in the sink. If you went in the Mediterranean today, the way you are, you'd be dead in a day. You are not ready for war." And we corrected everything we could, headed back to New London, had a short availability there, got rid of as much noise as we could, cut the silhouette down, and went out to the Pacific. We completed one patrol, not very successfully, made one approach, did not sink the ship, came back to San Francisco for overhaul. And my big achievement there was meeting Barbara at a junior league party and having one date before the ship sailed again for the Pacific.
And we would come into San Francisco looking for fun. And I went to a dance held by the Junior League at one of the San Francisco hotels. And I saw this gorgeous red-headed girl in a green dress across the hall. Asked her for a dance. And after a couple of dances, asked her for her telephone number. At first, a little reluctant to give it to me. But we finally got through that hurdle, and then I invited her to a ship's party because we were just about to leave at that point. And the ship's party was a wild melee. We made a big mistake. We had it in a downtown bare dining room, I suppose, of some service club. And it got a little bit out of hand, and I was so impressed with Barbara because she would realize that this is a problem that I, as the exec, had to handle. So I was stopping fights. One of the sailors threw another sailor through the glass doors of the elevator, and by the time I got back from that, there was another fight at our table. And we finally got that calmed down. I was delayed picking her up because the ship's truck had broken down on the bridge, and it took a long time to get her home, and I thought that this is not the way to treat your date on the first time you take her out. But we had another, I guess maybe we had one or two other opportunities before we finally sailed. And then we'd gone out in the Pacific for a couple of years. And when I came back, I called her up, and she had a date that evening with an Army officer, but said fine, she'd come down to the St. Francis Hotel and we'd have a drink together. And the next day we went over and climbed Mount Tamalpais, and then on Sunday we went to church together, the Grace Cathedral. And I met her cousin Peggy, who lived just outside of town, met her mother. Decided this is the woman I'd like to spend the rest of my life with. And after about 3 or 4 days of enjoying San Francisco, I asked her if she would be my wife. And she was wise enough to say, well, this is a little bit sudden, and we have to think this one over a little bit. But to my great pleasure, I wrote her about every 2 or 3 days once I got back to Annapolis, and we agreed to meet in Logansport at grandfather's house as a sort of a neutral spot at Christmas time, because I could get maybe 3 or 4 days leave. And by that time I had an engagement ring, and she accepted my offer at grandfather's house, and we were married the following March. It was a wonderful experience. And of course I've told all you fellas, now that's not the way to do it. You ought to spend a little time getting to know somebody. But in those days there just wasn't that much time available. And I was so sure right away it was the right choice that I didn't want to wait any longer. This was on the Mississippi River with a reunion of the submarine Barb. Our captain, Gene Fluckey, had written a book called Thunder Below, and he was taking the proceeds of this book to invite all of the enlisted crew and all the officers that had sailed with him in the Barb to sail up the Mississippi River for a week's cruise. I was delighted to see when I joined the Delta Queen to find my roommate was Russ Element. And as I walked in the room and greeted Russ, I said, Russ, I'm glad you're here, because if you weren't here, I wouldn't be either. Russ was Baker's striker, as we call it, a non-rated seaman preparing to be a petty officer, Baker, on the Barb, when we got ourselves into trouble. We were making a very fast dive on the way out to War Patrol and took the down angle of about 30 degrees. We're practicing diving as fast as we could go. We do this by making top speed on the surface, sounding the diving alarm, flooding all the tanks, and putting full dive on the bow planes, and down she goes. Well, when we got maximum dive angle, and the diving officer directed that we come back up to level off at 100 feet, couldn't do it. The bow planes had jammed in full dive. A relay in the electrical system had burned out, and there wasn't time to shift to mechanical and crank them back up again. Diving officer correctly ordered hold back full and blow main ballast, but the petty officer on the main ballast manifold slipped. The high angle on the deck slipped all the way to the bottom of the control room, and there's nobody on the manifold to open the valves to blow air into the tanks and blow out the water and surface. Element looks out the galley, which is a compartment, one compartment aft away from the control room, saw what was going on, knew what needed to be done, jumped out of the galley, jumped through the watertight door into the control room, slid down the deck, grabbed the handles as he went by, braced his feet, and blew main ballast. Here's a seaman who was not in the control party, had nothing to do with operating the submarine, but
in the process of qualifying, understood what had to be done and acted on it. Russ Elliman, we all were very grateful to him. Jammed in full dive. A relay in the electrical system had burned out, and there wasn't time to shift to mechanical and crank them back up again. Diving officer correctly ordered hold back full and blow main ballast, but the petty officer on the main ballast manifold slipped. The high angle on the deck slipped all the way to the bottom of the control room, and there's nobody on the manifold to open the valves to blow air into the tanks and blow out the water and surface. Elliman looks out the galley, which is a compartment, one compartment aft away from the control room, saw what was going on, knew what needed to be done, jumped out of the galley, jumped through the watertight door into the control room, slid down the deck, grabbed the handles as he went by, braced his feet, and blew main ballast. Here's a seaman who was not in the control party, had nothing to do with operating the submarine, but in the process of qualifying, understood what had to be done and acted on it. Russ Elliman, we all were very grateful to him. One of the interesting assignments at NOL was a member of a 5-person team to design the first underwater nuclear weapons that the Navy had. And to understand this, since nobody had even seen one of these, we went out to Los Alamos, looked at the first nuclear weapons, watched some demonstrations of firing and explosions. And then within 2 years, we had designed a family of these weapons ready, far enough ready to actually build their construction, and had the Navy Department authorize them. So it's a speed-up process that you would never see today. We met one Sunday afternoon to figure out what we would call them. We took our wives' first names and had a spectrum of about 5, Alice, Betty, and so on, and then decided that wasn't too smart an idea, and we chose neutral women's names. This is an 8-foot pram. I bought a kit, and it said that any high school student with a screwdriver and a hammer can put this together over a weekend. Well, it took me a full week, and every woodworker's clamp I could borrow to get those compound curves to stay where they were supposed to be when they're glued. I built this in the living room in the house, but when I was almost finished and putting in the oarlock blocks, I stood it up on edge, and it got away from me and fell the other way, dropped against the dining room table, and put a big gouge in the mahogany tabletop, at which point I was invited to take this boat outdoors and finish it out on the patio. That patio was the scene later of a garden. I built a hydroponic garden where that boat is shown here by constructing by using plastic that's used in chicken houses, which allows ultraviolet light to come through, but protects it from more damaging rays and keeps the weather out to some degree. I ran a duct from the heating system in the house through the eaves of the house to warm it, and then put a electric heater in with a thermostat that would turn it on to top it off if it got a little bit too chilly, and that was not enough heat to keep it warm. It was a hydroponic garden which didn't use any dirt, and had 3 trays made out of cypress, which were perhaps 6 inches deep and maybe 6 feet long, filled with gravel. The plants were grown in sterile sand until they grew very fine roots. Then they were transplanted into the gravel, and they were fed by a pump from a 50-gallon drum with the microelements of the magnesium and the phosphorus and the nitrogen, the things that you need. In the drum, a timer would turn on a little pump, and it would pump this liquid into these tanks. It would sit there for 20 minutes, feed the roots, and then run back out again. It's amazing how well it worked. I would grow tomatoes there that would go up to the ceiling and run down the length of the porch and down again, 30 feet long. And they would grow a lot of flowers but no fruit. So I went over to the agronomist at Greenbelt and I said, I don't understand what's wrong here. I'm growing tomatoes that look wonderful. They're flowering but no fruit. He said, son, did you ever hear about the birds and the bees? He said, the male and female blossoms and tomatoes are adjacent to each other. In the lab here, we fertilize them with a camel's hair brush, but you haven't got time to do that. And so you just go along and bat them with your hand when the sun's shining and they're open, and that ought to do the job. So at noon, I'd come home from the Naval Ordnance Lab and take care of the sex life of my tomatoes and smack them and go down the row. And we grow most beautiful 1 pound tomatoes. And they're flawless because they're in a controlled atmosphere. They tasted good, they look great. But the first one cost $100. We drove out, Barbara and I drove out to California from Silver Spring to take a ship to Hawaii to join the Taylor. We had a new gold convertible, and boy did we have a time. We drove to all the state parks, visited all the relatives along the way, and had a great trip. Put the car on an Army transport and made our way to Hawaii.
So you had a gold convertible in Hawaii.
Yeah. Pretty nice, huh?
Yeah, not bad.
Titled Barbara at Waikiki Beach, Diamond Head in the background. We spent as much time as we could on the beach. Barb loved it, and the beach was always good for swimming. I loved to surf. I'd get aboard and go out and catch a wave. And this is a nice scene of the beach. Titled Wearing COUSS Taylor in the captain's chair. And probably reflecting on the first day that I joined the Taylor and we got underway. We had been underway more than 10 or 15 minutes when we lost the main feed pump in the forward engine room. Had only one engine, and then the main feed pump in the after engine room, and we're underway in the middle of Pearl Harbor with no way on, and ships getting underway in all directions, submarines coming out of one side, destroyers the other. I waited patiently, and we got feed pressure back, started out the channel, and we had a 20-degree gyro error. Finally got outside, did our exercises, headed back in, lost an engine again, put a tug alongside and put her back alongside the dock. Not the best beginning for a new commanding officer. Since then we've been 2 deployments in the 7th Fleet during the Korean War, never missed a commitment, and I was very proud of the ship and sorry to leave her. She was good enough so she won the Battle Efficiency Pennant the next year under the next commanding officer. This is a picture of Taylor with me on the bridge, fueling from alongside an aircraft carrier. It looks close, and it is. We would usually come in alongside about 100 feet away, 120 feet away, put a line across with a telephone so we could talk ship to ship, put a high line across, pull a hose across, put it in the tank, and start pumping. And it took some careful seamanship on the part of the officer deck to keep her right in position so we didn't stretch out the hose or the lines. And if it's very rough and the ship's rolling heavily, it takes a certain amount of skill to do this. But this is the secret of success of the Navy: fueling at sea, arming at sea, and the whole fleet can keep the sea for as long as necessary. I was impressed by the ability of blimps to fly out ahead of the fleet and to stay aloft for a day or two at a time, and to locate submarines and let the airplanes and let the surface ships know where the submarine was, who could come in and attack. So I thought it'd be a good idea to fly in a blimp and understand what the difficulty was in keeping station in bad weather. I flew up to Lakehurst and was taken for a ride in a blimp. It was fortunate because this was the last one in service. We'd lost one in a swamp somewhere down south. We had lost one which had hooked its skin on the edge of the hangar and penetrated the balloon inside that carried the helium, and they lost all their helium. And then in a bizarre accident, we had a third one deflated by a very bad blizzard. At Lakehurst, the snow blew in through the vents at the top of the hangar, accumulated on the top of the blimp, and the weight of it was squished down on top of the helium inside. They're usually ready for that, and when they see this happening with the very dry snow blowing in, they have sailors up there with brooms sweeping off the top of the blimp. In this case, they were slow getting the sailors up. They didn't sweep fast enough, and it collapsed the blimp, losing a full load of helium. The Chief of Naval Operations says, "We've had enough of these, decommission the squadron." So shortly after my flight, this blimp was folded up and put away. As a matter of fact, one of the blimps ran out of gas or had engine failure down off Key West, and a Navy submarine passed them a line, or picked up a line from the blimp and towed them in, which was one of the great achievements of the submarine force. One of the great embarrassments of naval aviation. I asked if I could fly, and the pilot let me sit in the pilot seat with a great big yoke. And he said, "Have you got a truck driver's license?" I said, "Well, no," but he said, "That's what it's going to feel like." I don't know that there's any hydraulic boost on the controls, but you had to use a lot of muscle to move the elevators and the rudder. Your feet with a rudder and elevators with big yoke. And it moves so sluggishly that you can't get ahead of it. And as we started to go across the New Jersey countryside, I began to gallop like this. And I'd come down, and all the horses and the cows and the chickens that went squawking away, and I'd get back up where I belonged, and I'd come down again. And when I sensed that it was starting down, I'd pull up on the yoke, but I was too late. By that time, it's already on the way down. And it's like flying a submarine. There's a lag time you have to get used to. We're back now where we'd been 10 years before. I'm now ordered to command Destroyer Squadron 25, 13 ships, where the last time I was there I was captain of Taylor, one ship in that squadron. Wonderful assignment, and the only time probably since I've been in the Navy that I asked for a job. I'd left the Naval Anti-Submarine Warfare School in Norfolk, realizing that the Pacific Fleet anti-submarine warfare was nowhere near the equal of the Atlantic Fleet. And I'd been teaching anti-submarine warfare to the task groups and the entire Second Fleet in the Atlantic coast. And I was getting the operation orders from the Pacific Fleet and aware that they were nowhere near as competent as we were getting to be. And I called up the detailer and the Bureau personnel and said, "I think it would be a good idea if you transplanted what we know here to the Pacific, and the way to do that is to send me to Honolulu. And Squadron 25 is about due for a change in command. What do you think about that?" And they said, "That's a good idea, and you'll get your orders." Sure enough, that's where we went. One of the events, now we're in 1962, one of the events outside of Honolulu, which involves all of the Hawaiian Islands, is a big celebration for all of the Samoans who live in the islands. It's an annual convention where they have dancing, they have contests, and it's a big deal. Now, I noticed that my steward on my flagship, my squadron command, was so I knew he was a Samoan. He was an enlisted steward, and he was using a telephone a great deal for a week preceding this event. And then he invited Barbara and me to be his guests at this Samoan celebration, Samoan Day. So we went over to the location on the other side of the island, and we're seated next to Governor King, the governor of Hawaii. And my steward, Milo, was the head judge for all of the dancing and for all of the contests. And then we participated in the party afterwards, in the dinner and the barbecue and the luau. It was a great afternoon. I was very impressed by Milo as the head Samoan in the Hawaiian Islands and a spiritual leader and priest for all Samoans. I was told later that they had a very rowdy party that night, and the next morning he gave the sermon and chewed them all out for having such a bad time. Well, as the commander of the NATO submarines, I ran a couple of exercises with NATO Six Nations submarines, and the French participated even though they had withdrawn from NATO, but they had not withdrawn their forces. And so I had a squadron of French submarines, and the squadron commander was reported to me, and we ran this exercise together. So I sailed in the French submarine Eurydice, and Galatée was with us, the two of them. Sailors on this submarine made a little American admiral's flag for me, and they flew that from the periscope, which is the first time I had flown my admiral's flag at sea, which I thought was a lovely gesture. We ran the exercise for a couple of days, and my chief recollection of the French submarine navy is that every morning at about 10:30, we would stop the exercise and have wine and cheese for half an hour, and then we'd resume the exercise and get on with the battle. Now that this is again a delightful way to operate.
Very civilized.
About 2 months after I left the command, both these submarines were on the bottom. They were well-run boats. We never knew what happened to one of them. There was a diving accident. The other was rammed and badly damaged by a South African destroyer, and they had to beach it to save it. Now, 1965, 26 February, Douglas was born at the Naval Hospital at Mtarfa. Mtarfa is the traditional city, as in all towns in that part of the world, where for defense they'd gather the central government of the city into an enclosure called Mdina, and Mtarfa was just on the outskirts of this central city called Mdina. They had not had a flag officer's child born in this hospital for many years, since the British admirals were older, and they made a big deal of this. They repainted the whole ward for Barbara, and after Doug arrived, they wouldn't allow us to see him for 2 days. They wanted to be awfully sure that there was no way of letting this child get sick from visitors. So Jamie and Robbie and I would go over to visit, write a note on a rock, tie it on a piece of paper, tie it around a rock, and throw it through the window. And then Barb would hold up little Douglas, and we'd wave and say hello, and then go back home again. We had two delightful enlisted stewards who were part of our family, Petty Officer Quibel and Francisco Rodriguez, and they took care of our family for the entertaining that we did. And any time an American ship came in, we'd entertain the wardroom officers. We entertained the Maltese nobility, we entertained the British officers, and we had parties at our house probably several times a week. When we would go out to dinner, we would sometimes have to leave Douglas at the friendly store during the day while the boys were in school. And the neighbors all came to know Doug very well. This fat little baby in a baby carriage. They'd feed him pickles and crackers out of the barrel. Barbara told me one time that she was pushing Doug around in a baby carriage, and a Maltese woman came up and said, "I know this child. I don't know you. Who are you?" "No, I'm Douglas's mother." Oh, okay. They'd seen the baby over in the friendly store all the time, but Barb was off with me doing our official duties. On Sundays, we'd often have picnics up in Camino Gozo, at the end of the island, little islands just off the end of Malta. And the American admiral did not have a barge. We didn't own a boat. So we would sail in either the Italian admiral's barge or the British admiral's barge. And they competed in having elaborate lunches. So we would anchor in these beautiful little bays gorgeous water, gorgeous scenery, weather perfect. And we water ski around for a while and then come back, and then they'd serve, they'd have their stewards aboard, and they'd serve gorgeous luncheons on tablecloths with wine. Then we water ski some more, and then come home. Well, we flew back to Norfolk, now it's 1967, and I became the commander of cruiser destroyer Flotilla 4, about 23 or 24 ships in Norfolk. We rented a house, and I was delighted to find that the Admiral's barge was a very speedy boat, and I would take it out and water ski behind it until the Commander-in-Chief of the Atlantic Fleet found out I had such a good barge, and he took it away for his own use. Then on the 7th of March, Katie was born, so now we had 3 boys and a girl and a complete family. Same time we were moving clothes with wine. Then we water ski some more, then come home. Well, we flew back to Norfolk, now it's 1967, and I became the commander of cruiser destroyer Flotilla 4, about 23 or 24 ships in Norfolk. We rented a house, and I was delighted to find that the Admiral's barge was a very speedy boat, and I would take it out and water ski behind it until the Commander-in-Chief of the Atlantic Fleet found out I had such a good barge, and he took it away for his own use. Then on the 7th of March, Katie was born, so now we had 3 boys and a girl and a complete family. Same time we were moved to government quarters over at the Naval Air Station, and we were experimenting with a fold-out camper. We had such a good time with that we decided we'd buy a self-contained trailer that we could tow across the country when we were going out to Monterey, which we knew would be the next assignment. And as I look back on this thing, this is a marvelous achievement of Barbara. If you imagine moving a family from a foreign country to Norfolk and renting a house, having a baby, moving the house again to Naval Air Station, then moving again to Monterey, all in 10 months, while I was very busy with this big command, with all these destroyers and ships in Norfolk, not only in command of the division, but also the representative of the cruiser destroyer force in that area and responsible for the maintenance of all these ships. Well, Monterey was idyllic. Barbara had grown up there, she'd known Carmel, loved it, and couldn't have been happier. The quarters we had in the Naval Postgraduate School are probably the most attractive in the country, and we began to enjoy living in that center of gracious living. I remember Barb saying, "You can leave me here the rest of my life." I think she just enjoyed it so much. One of the great things we did was do a major backpacking expedition up in the Sierra Nevada range. Got interested in this when Jamie told me that would be fun, and I didn't believe him until we went and did it. I thought anybody that slept on the ground was out of their mind. But our trip up in the wilderness in the high Sierras was one of the highlights of my life, and so much fun that we did it with Douglas a few years later when he was 14. Katie Doug, summer 1969. The 2 children are sitting in the door of our camping trailer. This was a self-contained trailer that we drove all the way across the country and all up and down the California coast. Barbara loved it because it was her own home. In our quarters in Monterey, we had 4 stewards, and the kitchen was run by the stewards. But here, everything was set just as she wanted it. And the children all had their jobs. When we would come into a campsite, one child would be responsible for leveling the trailer, another for turning on the gas heater and the gas stove, another one, not the most popular job, to rig up the hose and run it into the sewer for discharging the holding tank. And we would roll out the awning and would go swimming or have a campfire And we just loved that trailer and had a good time with it. Well, it's now 1971. We had a family ski weekend at Squaw Valley, which was a delightful time. In March, we had set up a sailing club at the PG school, and we christened and accepted 4 shield sloops, and I felt that it was time now to head east. So they had some wonderful parties for us in Monterey. The most affectionate farewell I think I've ever had, with gifts and speeches and a wonderful time. We loaded up the car, loaded up the trailer. Jamie stayed in Monterey because he still had some school to finish, and Robbie and Katie and Doug and I were in the car with Barbara towing the trailer behind us. And we'd hoped to get to our cousin's house the second night, but on the way down a long hill, heading down past Bakersfield with Barbara driving, and I was asleep in the right-hand seat, I heard Barbara say, "I'm having trouble steering." And as I woke up and tried to reach over and help, the car flipped and jackknifed, and we ended up with the car rolling several times, with the trailer completely shattered into pieces, and Barbara thrown out of the car and unconscious on the road, Katie thrown out of the back with a broken leg, it turned out, and Robbie and I inside with Douglas. The car upside down, and fortunately it didn't burn.
What do I think of God? I'm glad there is one. I'm sure there is. It was always a great comfort to me on my submarine when we never knew what the night would hold, to turn into my bunk with my life jacket and my flashlight and say my prayers and go to sleep. Put your trust in the hands of someone who is far more understanding, far more powerful than you, and you get on with the day, get on with the night. What do you think? There's so many wonderful things in the world, and there's so much beauty in the world that obviously a superior intelligence has created it, and it's our job to preserve it. And when I see a small child and the perfection of a little baby, I just marvel, absolutely marvel. In getting ready for this project of yours, Rob, I've enjoyed going back and reading some of the things that my forebears had said. And they lived in a time when people were fiercely independent because they depended pretty much on their own abilities to survive and to raise a family. They didn't depend on local or federal government to bail them out. There are good things and bad things about that. Since they had to depend on themselves, they did their best to prepare for it. They realized that hard work was important, staying out of debt was important. On the other hand, ruin was around the corner too, very quickly. And there was very little help other than what neighbors could give.
On the 30th of March, I retired from active service from the Navy. It was obvious I couldn't be deployed any further with a small family. They were without some way of taking care of them, and I was offered the opportunity to become the Dean of Admissions at the Naval Academy. My friend Jim Calvert was the superintendent, was looking for some way of making sure we had permanence in that position. I thought that would be a fine opportunity. We could settle down in Annapolis. Children could go to school close by, and I could use my experience in a way that would be useful to the Navy. So we began to move on that. On the 29th of April, I was invited to a party at the Calvert's house, Buchanan House, the superintendent's quarters at the Naval Academy. And I had a suspicion there was something up because Peggy Calvert called me and said, are you coming? Are you coming? Hope you'll be here for dinner and the weekend. And I just got the invitation in the mail. I said, of course, I'll be there. In the meantime, she had invited her longtime friend, Patricia Hicks, to join us for dinner and the weekend. And I remember coming into the Buchanan House lobby before dinner and chatting with the guests and with Jim Calvert, my old friend from Norfolk, who was now the superintendent of the academy. And just before dinner, I looked up, and coming down the spiral staircase in Buchanan Hall was this beautiful woman who was to be my dinner partner, Patricia Hicks. I realized that she was a designer and asked her if she would like the next morning to come out and see a house that I was building over in Providence. We walked over to take a quick look at this, which was now just an excavation with some brick up about half waist high. And Pat looked at it and I explained what the arrangements were. I had no problem building the house. I'd done that several times before, but I had no feeling for texture and wall hangings and window treatments and color of walls. And Pat, in the nicest way, walked around, looked at it rather carefully, and then said, well, had you considered this? Did you think about that? Here's something you might do in this room. And I thought, this is wonderful. Taking me into confidence as another house, the superintendent's quarters at the Naval Academy. And I had a suspicion there was something up because Peggy Calvert called me and said, are you coming? Are you coming? Hope you'll be here for dinner and the weekend. And I just got the invitation in the mail. I said, of course, I'll be there. In the meantime, she had invited her longtime friend, Patricia Hicks, to join us for dinner and the weekend. And I remember coming into the Buchanan House lobby before dinner and chatting with the guests and with Jim Calvert, my old friend from Norfolk, who was now the superintendent of the academy. And just before dinner, I looked up, and coming down the spiral staircase in Buchanan Hall was this beautiful woman who was to be my dinner partner, Patricia Hicks. I realized that she was a designer and asked her if she would like the next morning to come out and see a house that I was building over in Providence. We walked over to take a quick look at this, which was now just an excavation with some brick up about half waist high. And Pat looked at it and I explained what the arrangements were. I had no problem building the house. I'd done that several times before, but I had no feeling for texture and wall hangings and window treatments and color of walls. And Pat, in the nicest way, walked around, looked at it rather carefully, and then said, well, had you considered this? Did you think about that? Here's something you might do in this room. And I thought, this is wonderful. Taking me into confidence as another professional. And we, neither of us had any idea that 2 years from now we'd both be living in the same house. The big event was 28 October 1973, when Pat and I were married in Princeton on a gorgeous autumn day with the leaves dropping and all our families around, and began a whole new life, which has been wonderful in every way.
Amen.
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 Turned out to be an absolutely gorgeous day. You remember that? A nice,
It was wonderful.
sunny, warm fall day on the Princeton campus. The wedding ceremony was in the Princeton Chapel. And the leaves were falling. It was an absolutely perfect time. And I think our happiness here shows so clearly in that picture. in the admissions world at the Naval Academy, things moved very quickly when the Congress passed a law saying we should admit women the coming spring. That gave us about 6 months to prepare for this when it normally takes a year, and we had already been thinking about this very carefully. As the Dean of Admissions, I'd gone up to the Officer Candidate School where they've been training women for commissions for a long time. And I remember being asked to review the line of women candidates who were on parade. And when you inspect a group of sailors that are all men, they're looking rigidly ahead, scared to death you'll find something wrong with the uniform and correct them. When you walk down the line of women, for some reason these women all were looking down rather than straight ahead, and then when I'd get directly in front of them, they'd look up and open their eyes, and it's like a flower opening in a garden. I find it hard to find anything wrong with any one of them. I said, this is going to be a little bit of a problem for us at the Naval Academy. We're sailing on Chesapeake Bay. In this particular frame, I guess, is Pat and Katie. As a member of the Cruising Club of America, we would have cruises in the fall and the spring locally in Chesapeake Bay, and we always chartered a boat or went with friends. And then there would be a national cruise in the winter or the summer, and we would often go on those as well. We have cruised together in Baja California, at the Grenadines, in Nantucket, and twice on the coast of Ireland on CCA cruises. I have a Coast Guard, at that time I had a Coast Guard six-pack license, which qualified me for small boats and small craft. That's the first step in licensing for Coast Guard.
Huh.
And we did that 1 year at the Naval Academy where we thought we ought to all get Coast Guard licenses, those of us that are coaching. So we brought a Coast Guard officer down who led us through the preliminaries, and then we self-taught. We got the instruction books, and we would quiz each other and bring ourselves up to speed on all the things you have to cover: rules of the road, lights, dunnage, how you stow cargo. And then we took the exam. And I failed the Coast Guard rules of the road part of the exam, which is embarrassing to me because while I was on active service, I got very interested in rules of the road and worked a 50-question self-taught seminar for the crews of my submarine, my destroyer. I updated it for a destroyer division, made everybody pass this thing. And then my destroyer squadron, I did the same thing. And it was good enough that the whole Atlantic Fleet copied it and used it for all their ships, and so did the Pacific Fleet. So I thought, well, you know, I know this stuff, and I failed it. So the only way to get my license was to go up to Baltimore and take it over again. So I went to the Merchant Marine headquarters in Baltimore, and I didn't tell them what my rank was. I said Robert McNitt. Took the exam again, and the Lieutenant Commander of Coast Guard running a place came in and told all of us merchant sailors and me, now you go out and sit on those chairs outside that we'll mark these exams and tell you whether you passed or not. So we're all sitting there in the chairs, and the officer running the center came out, this Coast Guard officer. He walks right over and looks me in the eye, stands in front of me, and says, well, you knocked it this time, Admiral. He was just waiting to catch me. My old friend in Annapolis, Pierre Bernard, asked if I'd like to be on the board of directors of the Annapolis Banking and Trust Company. And I said, Pierre, I don't know anything about banking. He said, well, we'll teach you. We'd like to have you join our board of directors. And it would be a good window for the Naval Academy on the community in Annapolis, and a good way for the bank to have a little better understanding of what the Naval Academy is all about when issues come up that involve us both. And that looked like a good idea. I said, fine, I'll be delighted to do that. So I joined the bank board, and after a few months they made me chairman of the audit committee. That's a quick way to learn how a bank works. And in order to really understand it, I signed up for a weekend seminar at the University of New Hampshire. And spent a weekend there in an auditing seminar, and came back with a little better understanding how to do this job. And I was on the board and on the audit committee for about 13 years, and it was a wonderful experience. A group called the radm Industries in Annapolis decided it was time to do something about helping homeless with a more permanent arrangement. And so for the first year, each church in turn would take responsibility for a month or so, and the homeless would be put on cots for the night in the entrance to the, what would be called the narthex, I guess, or the lobby of St. Anne's Church, or in Carroll House at St. Mary's, or in the Presbyterian Church would have a parish house. And volunteers would prepare dinner and serve it, prepare breakfast. No, actually in breakfast we would not. We would give them a chit for breakfast, and they'd go over to the deli and to get their breakfast. But we would accommodate anywhere from 15 to 30 homeless folk at night in each of these very unsatisfactory temporary arrangements. And then the area ministries, with tremendous effort, managed to get the neighborhoods to agree to build a building out on West Street. And this turned out to be a very successful arrangement when they finally got their neighbors to agree and get the permission of the authorities to build this. Took a commercial building and arranged the downstairs to be a gathering place with a dining room, and then room to put cots at night, and then bedrooms on the second, the narthex, I guess, or the lobby of St. Anne's Church, or in Carroll House at St. Mary's, or in the Presbyterian Church would have a parish house. And volunteers would prepare dinner and serve it, prepare breakfast. No, actually in breakfast we would not. We would give them a chit for breakfast, and they'd go over to the deli and to get their breakfast. But we would accommodate anywhere from 15 to 30 homeless folk at night in each of these very unsatisfactory temporary arrangements. And then the area ministries, with tremendous effort, managed to get the neighborhoods to agree to build a building out on West Street. And this turned out to be a very successful arrangement when they finally got their neighbors to agree and get the permission of the authorities to build this. Took a commercial building and arranged the downstairs to be a gathering place with a dining room, and then room to put cots at night, and then bedrooms on the second floor. And we would take watches. When Pat and I would go, or would be another couple, and a family would come in and bring dinner already prepared. We'd serve it, clean up, and then we'd take watches during the night, so there's always somebody awake while this is going on. But we did this for 2 or 3 years, just taking an occasional turn of duty. And it was a satisfying thing. I think it was a big help. We came to appreciate the homeless folk, who many of them were just out of luck for the time being. Sometimes families, sometimes individuals, sometimes people that came to a town looking for work and didn't find it right away. Others that had bad luck and were dispossessed. But there's always a need for this. Ready to go. Well, Robbie, this morning we went over to the Halsey Field House at the Naval Academy, and you brought your camera in and took some shots while I was working out, first on the leg machines, and then later did about 5 or 6 laps around the track, practicing for race walking competition, which we may do here at the end of this week. And so how did I get involved in this? Well, way back in 1989, I was diagnosed in one of my annual physicals with what they thought was adult onset diabetes, high sugar content. And the prescription was either take some medicine for it or do more extensive workouts and watch your diet. So I said, fine, let's do the diet and the workouts. And I had been watching Ellery Clark, who's an old friend and was the cross-country coach over at the Naval Academy, as he was doing race walking. And he was a champion race walker. His father had been a great track man, had been a Harvard student, and the first United States entry in the Olympics as a track man. And Harvard said, okay, you can go over to the Olympics, but athletics is not what we do here at Harvard, and you must not tell them you're a Harvard student. Well, Ellery had carried on this tradition and had won championships in track, and now as an older statesman, he converted to race walking. So that sounded to me like a good thing to do. He showed me how to do it, and I began to practice. Most every state has what they call their senior Olympics once a year. And then every 2 years, there's a national competition where all of the athletes who have been either gold or silver medal winners will gather in one city in the country and compete. Well, I've been doing this now 13 times, starting when I was 74 years old in 1989, competing in my own age group, from 70 to 75, from 75 to 89, 75 to 80, 80 to 85, and so on every 5 years. And by working pretty hard at it and analyzing my stride and practicing throughout the year, I found I could hold my own with people in my own age group, and I've won the gold medal 11 out of 13 times. And then Pat and I have gone to the Nationals 3 times, once in San Antonio, once in Baton Rouge, and most recently in Disneyland in Norfolk, I guess 4 times. And 2 out of those 4, the last 2, I've been able to be ranked number 5 in the country in my age group, and held that for the subsequent Nationals. So it's been a good deal. And then in 1997, we extended this a little bit and went to Utah for the Huntsman World Senior Games, competed in the 1,500 meter race walk and also 5,000 meters, and won both of those. It was a nasty, cold, rainy day, temperature just a little bit above freezing, and it was so windy that while I was doing my 5,000 meter race, the wind picked up the tent over in the recreation area, hoisted it up in the air. It flew over the fence and landed in the track adjacent to me in the next lane over, and was galloping down the track as fast as I was going. Pat stayed outdoors as long as she could to get a couple of times and a couple of photographs, and then we were happy to get in and warm up. And in '99, the Maryland Senior Olympics extended it to the winter, and just for fun, I went up to Liberty in Pennsylvania, competed in the giant slalom and in the slalom, downhill racing, and was able to win a gold medal in both of those. My most vivid memory is being up in the start house, getting ready to start a run, and the racer behind me tapped me on the shoulder, and he said, my doctor told me not to do this. And I laughed and I said, well, my doctor told me the same thing. His advice was, if you were my son, I'd knock off this business of going around the gates. And so we agreed between each other we would get different doctors and went ahead and raced. But I think that's probably the last time I'd done any active racing. And a little bit on the NASCAR course for time, but just enjoyed doing that just to see if I could. We had a wonderful event at Winter Park. Pat had the good idea of trying to invite all of the family together there and to rent adjacent condos. And so we managed to organize this over the year. And we had most of our families there. But the really delightful event was a night where we rented a sleigh. with 4 big Percheron horses. We gathered at about dark, and all of us got in this big sleigh and then went off through the woods on the night after the night where they had the biggest moon in several hundred years. Do you remember that?
I do remember that, yeah.
It was the winter solstice, and it was the largest moon that we'd had in 133 years. And it was interesting that the night before, a storm had gone through, so it was a clear night. And the moon was almost full. It was beautiful looking through the trees at the moon, and the snow was sifting down. It was still on the treetops as we went through the woods with the sleigh. I went through the calendars for 2004, 2005, and 2006, and 2006 so far. We're pretty much centered here at Ginger Cove. We haven't taken any large trips since then, and our life consists mostly of good times here at Ginger Cove with friends we've come to know well here, friends in town. My participation in committees at the Naval Academy, Fields Committee, the Naval Academy Foundation. I've been on their executive committee for a long time. The Naval Academy Sailing Foundation, I serve as a trustee, and these individual committees that come up from time to time.
Any plans coming up?
Well, we'll be attending all the home games here in football. We're going to do a trip up the Hudson River in October on the American Glory, which is a motor vessel. And we'll start from New York and go up to Yonkers, and then on up to West Point, and then Poughkeepsie, and on to Kingston, and back again. And the main purpose is to see the foliage in the fall along the Hudson River. And Pat's anxious to see the art museum at Vassar, which is new and beautiful. And I'd like to look up my grandmother's record and my mother's record at Vassar. Mother, I was surprised to discover, Robbie, when we were going through this, getting ready for you, was the valedictorian in her class at Vassar. I didn't know that. She never said it.
Any plans coming up?
Well, we'll be attending all the home games here in football. We're going to do a trip up the Hudson River in October on the American Glory, which is a motor vessel. And we'll start from New York and go up to Yonkers, and then on up to West Point, and then Poughkeepsie, and on to Kingston, and back again. And the main purpose is to see the foliage in the fall along the Hudson River. And Pat's anxious to see the art museum at Vassar, which is new and beautiful. And I'd like to look up my grandmother's record and my mother's record at Vassar. Mother, I was surprised to discover, Robbie, when we were going through this, getting ready for you, was the valedictorian in her class at Vassar. I didn't know that. She never said it. I think that's about it. It's been a great life, Robbie. A lot of activity, a lot of satisfying work, a lot of satisfying play, and there's nothing more satisfying than a happy family to surround you as you do this. So I'm grateful to the Navy. I'm grateful to my parents for having given us the head start that we all had. And all my 3 brothers and I are still, all of us, going along pretty well.
And you passed it on. You all passed it on well.
I hope so. I hope so. I'm so proud of all of our children who have all sought lives which contribute. They're good citizens, they're good people, and they're all fun to be with. And I just admire our children so much. And having with Pat, with a combined family of 8 children, this doubled my enjoyment, because Peter and Lane and Hope and Patty are all grand people as well. and everyone different, and everyone following their own bent, and all are people that we're very proud of, and they're endlessly amusing.
I've had a full life, a wonderful life. And at times like our birthday party the other night over at Townsend's, where the family gathers around, I feel so fortunate. So I just enjoy my family and enjoy my friends. Accomplish a couple of things once in a while that might help someplace, and take every day as it comes, although I guess actually I'd probably take a week at a time.
I've had a lifetime association with the Episcopal Church, probably because my grandmother, who was a very firm guide in our family, had been an Episcopalian, as well as my mother. Although father was a Presbyterian, but deferred to their interest, and so our boys all became choir boys, acolytes at St. Peter's Church in Perth Amboy. I've been a lay leader in most places where we've lived. I'm an usher at the present time at St. Peter's Church, or St. Anne's Church in town here. I've taught Sunday school and learned a lot from the kids. And have on occasion actually taught adult classes in the various churches where we've been. And the last theme, I must say, there's a humble appreciation and gratitude for good luck. Probably, as you will hear in some of these stories, there have been at least 3 or 4 times when I was growing up that I was lucky to make 16 or 17 years old. We did absolutely stupid things out on the water and somehow always survived. Wartime, in a couple of wars, been shot at by guns, by torpedoes, by bombs, by people that wished us no good, and always survived. We built a 10-foot dinghy designed by Atkins. We used it for many, many years. We were so concerned, or father was so concerned, that somebody would steal it, that he designed a very unusual way of locking it at night. We built a skid down on the beach. You could pull it up on the skid. He poured a concrete base right under the centerboard, made a centerboard out of sheet metal, galvanized sheet metal, put asbestos inside it so it couldn't be burned with a torch, put hacksaw blades along with the asbestos so you couldn't saw through it, and that centerboard would drop through a slot in the concrete pier that he made underneath it with a hole sideways where you could put a steel pipe through, and a hole where the lock would go, just big enough for a boy's hand to go in and snap the lock and unsnap it. If anybody could steal that boat, I can't imagine how they'd get it. And for many years, that's the way we secured it every night.
Well timed.